My son hit my face on a Tuesday morning in November, and the next day I served him a breakfast that changed his life forever. I'm Beatrice Caldwell, 82 years old, and I've survived a Depression-era childhood, a 47-year marriage to a good man, 3 decades as CFO of one of Boston's largest logistics firms, and 2 bouts with cancer. But nothing prepared me for the moment my own son's hand connected with my cheek in the kitchen where I'd made him thousands of meals. They say you never forget certain sounds. The crack of my husband Edward's voice saying, "I do," in 1965. The first cry of my babies. The slam of the gavel when I closed my biggest corporate deal in 1989. And the sharp, hollow sound of my son's palm against my 70-year-old face because I wouldn't sign papers giving him control of the 4. $5 million Edward and I spent our lives building. For 55 years, I changed Thomas's diapers, packed his lunches, paid for his college, bailed him out of his first business failure, and loved him with every fiber of my being. And in return, he looked at my white hair and saw a walking ATM machine with fading cognitive abilities. He was half right. My hair is white. But my mind? Sharp as the day I audited my first Fortune 500 company in 1972. What Thomas didn't know that Tuesday morning, as I stood in my Beacon Hill kitchen with my cheek burning and tears I refused to let fall, was that the frail old woman he'd just assaulted had already spent 6 weeks building a case that would make my corporate takeover strategies look like child's play. I've learned something in 8 decades on this earth. Underestimate a woman who survived the business world of the 1970s at your own peril. Especially when that woman has a photographic memory for numbers, a Rolodex of powerful allies, and absolutely nothing left to lose. So pull up a chair, subscribe to hear the whole story, and let me tell you about the breakfast that taught my son the most expensive lesson of his life. Because what I served him that Wednesday morning wasn't just eggs and toast. It was justice, plated and garnished with evidence. The signs started 6 months before that Tuesday morning, so subtle I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. It began with my reading glasses disappearing. I'd set them on the marble counter in my kitchen, the same spot I'd used for 45 years, and they'd vanish. Thomas would find them in the refrigerator, in the linen closet, once even in the garden shed. He'd hold them up with this concerned expression that made my stomach turn, asking if I remembered putting them there. I didn't, because I hadn't. Then came the bills. Thomas started visiting every Sunday after Edward passed 3 years ago, and I appreciated the company at first. A widow's house gets quiet in ways that make your ears ring. But these Sunday visits turned into financial interrogations disguised as concern. He'd sort through my mail, shaking his head at envelopes I supposedly forgot to open. Electric bills marked past due, credit card statements with late fees I'd never seen before. I built my career on precision. For 30 years, I managed budgets that would make your head spin, tracked millions in logistics operations, and never once missed a payment on anything. My credit score was 820 since before Thomas learned to drive. But suddenly, at 82, I was supposedly forgetting to pay for basic utilities? The real crack appeared on a Sunday in September. I was making my famous pot roast, the same recipe I'd perfected in 1968, when Thomas brought up the procuration papers. Ashley, his wife of 20 years, sat at my dining table with this practiced sympathy on her face that reminded me of a funeral director. She reached across and patted my hand like I was a confused child, while Thomas explained that a general power of attorney would make everything so much easier for me. He used words like simplified and protected and secure. He talked about my age, about how managing finances was stressful, about how he just wanted his mother to enjoy her golden years without worrying about paperwork. Ashley nodded along, mentioning a friend whose mother had been so relieved to hand over financial management. I smiled and served the pot roast and said I'd think about it. But that night, lying in the bed where Edward died, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't experienced since my first corporate audit in 1972. The cold certainty that someone was lying to me. In my business days, I learned to trust my instincts. When numbers didn't add up, there was always a reason. When people got nervous about audits, they were always hiding something. And when my son couldn't meet my eyes while talking about protecting my interests, every alarm bell from 3 decades of financial oversight started ringing. The next morning, I did what I'd done countless times in conference rooms full of men who underestimated me. I started documenting everything. I bought a small notebook and kept it in my bra, a trick I learned in 1975 when a colleague was stealing credit for my work. Every time something went missing, I wrote down the date, time, and where I'd actually left it. Every bill Thomas claimed was overdue. I photographed before he arrived. Every conversation about my supposed memory problems got recorded in precise detail. For 2 weeks, I played along. I acted confused when Thomas pointed out my glasses in strange places. I furrowed my brow at bills I knew I'd paid. I let Ashley speak to me in that slow, loud voice people use with the elderly and the simple-minded, and I watched. I watched Thomas's eyes dart to my desk when he thought I wasn't looking. I watched Ashley's hand hover over my mail before I could reach it. I watched them exchange glances across my dining room table that spoke volumes about plans I wasn't supposed to understand. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd been pretending to nap, another skill from my corporate days, looking harmless while gathering intelligence, when I heard Thomas in my study. The old floorboard by Edward's desk still creaked after 45 years. I'd meant to fix it 1,000 times, but never did, and now I was grateful for that procrastination. Through the crack in my bedroom door, I watched my 55-year-old son photograph documents from my financial files with his phone. My investment statements, my property deeds, the information about the education fund I'd set up for his own children. My heart, which had survived 2 cancer battles and Edward's death, felt like it might actually stop. But I stayed still. I controlled my breathing the way I'd learned in the yoga classes I'd been taking since before Thomas was born. I waited until he left. Then I went to my study. Nothing was obviously disturbed. Thomas was careful. I'd taught him to be organized after all. But my bank statement from last month, the one showing the comfortable balance Edward and I had built through 50 years of careful saving and smart investing, was on top of a stack instead of filed chronologically where I'd left it. I sat at Edward's desk, in his old leather chair that still smelled faintly of his cologne, and I opened my laptop. My children think senior citizens can't navigate technology, but I'd been using computers since they took up entire rooms. I logged into my bank account, the password a combination of Edward's birthday and our anniversary that only I knew, and I saw it. $50,000. Gone. Transferred electronically to an account I didn't recognize. The transfer date was 3 weeks ago, right after the Sunday when Thomas first brought up the power of attorney. I sat there for a long time, my hands shaking on the keyboard. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't age-related cognitive decline. This was theft. This was my son, the baby I'd nursed and raised and sacrificed for, systematically stealing from me while trying to convince me I was losing my mind. That evening, when Thomas came by with takeout dinner, another kindness that suddenly felt like surveillance, I smiled and thanked him. I ate the mediocre Chinese food and listened to him talk about his day. I let him check that I'd taken my medications, the ones I'd been managing perfectly fine for 3 years since Edward died. And when he left, I sat down and made a list. Not of what I'd lost, but of what I still had. The name of every attorney who owed me favors from my corporate days, the phone number of the forensic accountant who'd helped me uncover embezzlement in 1988, and the detailed memory of every single financial decision I'd made for the past 60 years. Thomas thought he was dealing with a confused old woman. He forgot he was dealing with the woman who'd outsmarted corporate raiders, outlasted 3 recessions, and built an empire from nothing but intelligence and determination. The next morning, I called Samuel Richardson, the attorney who'd handled our family's legal matters since 1983. His voice was warm when he answered, asking about my health, my garden, whether I was still making that incredible pot roast. I told him I needed his help with a delicate family matter. I told him my son was stealing from me, and I told him I wanted documentation of everything before I made my next move. His tone changed immediately. The warmth became sharp focus, the social niceties dropped away. This was the Samuel who'd helped me navigate hostile board meetings and complex contract negotiations. He told me to touch nothing, change nothing, and let Thomas think his plan was working. Because the best way to catch a thief, he reminded me, was to let them think they'd already won. The next 3 weeks were the most exhausting performance of my life, and I'd once given a presentation to a board of directors the same day I found out Edward's father died. Every morning, I woke up at 6, a habit from 50 years of corporate life, and checked my online banking before Thomas could intercept any statements. I screenshot everything, saved it to a cloud drive my grandson had set up for my photos, and then went about my day pretending to be the confused old woman my son needed me to be. Samuel moved quickly but carefully. The forensic audit he commissioned was handled by a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd worked with me back in my logistics days. She was 60 now, sharp as broken glass, and she owed me a career favor from when I'd promoted her over 3 male candidates in 1995. Patricia didn't ask questions. She just took my banking information and went to work. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon. Samuel drove to my house personally, the first time he'd done that in years, and spread the documents across my dining room table. The same table where Thomas had eaten Sunday dinners and smiled while planning my financial destruction. The $50,000 I'd discovered was just the beginning. Over the past 4 months, Thomas had been systematically draining my accounts. Small transfers at first, $5,000 here, $7,000 there. Amounts that wouldn't trigger immediate alarm bells. He'd set up automatic withdrawals that mimicked my usual charitable donations and investment transfers. If I hadn't been checking my accounts daily, if I'd been the confused elderly woman he was trying to make me believe I was, I might not have noticed for months. The total was stunning, $215,000. I sat there staring at the numbers while Samuel poured me a brandy from the bottle Edward and I had been saving for special occasions. My hands were steady when I took the glass. Corporate training dies hard. But inside, I felt like I was falling. $215,000. Money that Edward and I had saved through decades of careful planning. Money we'd set aside for medical emergencies, for leaving something behind for our grandchildren, for the security we'd earned through 50 years of hard work. But Patricia's report revealed something worse than the theft itself. Thomas had been using my money to cover gambling debts. She'd tracked the withdrawals to payments to 3 different casinos in Atlantic City and 2 online betting sites. My son, who'd promised Edward on his deathbed that he'd look after me, was using my savings to fund poker games and sports betting. Samuel pushed another document across the table. This one was older, printed on different paper. It was a loan application from 8 months ago, right after Edward died. Thomas had tried to get a second mortgage on his house in Brookline, the house I'd helped him buy 15 years ago, and been denied. His debt-to-income ratio was too high. He owed more than $300,000 to various creditors. That's when he'd come up with the plan. Target his elderly widowed mother, make her seem incompetent, get control of her finances, and solve all his problems with money he thought she wouldn't miss or wouldn't be coherent enough to track. The worst document was at the bottom of the pile. It was a full conservatorship petition, already drafted by an attorney Thomas had hired. It claimed I was suffering from advancing dementia, that I was a danger to myself, that I'd been found wandering the neighborhood confused. All lies, but documented lies with an official stamp and legal language that made my blood run cold. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was preparing to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could control everything legally. Samuel explained that if Thomas had succeeded, I would have lost all legal authority over my own life. He could have forced me into a nursing facility, sold my house, liquidated my investments, all while claiming it was for my own protection. I asked Samuel how close Thomas had come to filing that petition. He checked the date on the document and met my eyes with an expression I'd seen in boardrooms when deals went bad. 3 days. Thomas had been planning to file in 3 days, right before Thanksgiving, when the whole family would be gathered at my house. He would have done it in front of everyone, probably with a notary standing by, turning it into this compassionate intervention for his declining mother. I finished the brandy and asked Patricia about the evidence trail. She smiled the way she used to in 1995 when we'd caught someone cooking the books. Everything was documented with timestamps, bank records, casino receipts that she'd subpoenaed through channels I didn't ask about. The transfers could be traced directly to Thomas's accounts and then to his creditors. His fingerprints were all over my financial destruction. That night, I didn't cry. I'd done enough crying in the 3 years since Edward died. Instead, I sat in his study and thought about the man I'd married in 1965. He'd been strong and gentle and honest to his core. He'd built a successful career in architecture, and together we'd created a life of comfort and security. We'd raised 3 children, though only Thomas lived nearby now. Edward had trusted our son. On his deathbed, weak with the cancer that finally took him, he'd made me promise to let Thomas help me with finances. He'd said I shouldn't have to worry about money matters alone. I'd kept that promise for 3 years. I'd let Thomas into my accounts, my home, my trust. And he'd used that access to steal from his dying father's widow. The grief hit me then, not for the money, but for the loss of something more valuable. I'd lost my son, not to death, but to greed and weakness, and a willingness to destroy his own mother for short-term gain. But grief is a luxury, and I'd learned in 8 decades that sometimes you have to pack it away and deal with business first. I opened my laptop and composed an email to my daughter Catherine in Seattle and my youngest Marcus in Atlanta. I told them I needed to talk about something serious at Thanksgiving. I told them to plan on staying for the whole weekend. I didn't mention why, but I made it clear that their presence wasn't optional. Then I sent a message to my 3 grandchildren, Thomas's 2 kids, Jennifer and Michael, plus Catherine's daughter Sophie. I told them their grandmother would like them at Thanksgiving dinner, that I had something important to share about family and responsibility, and the lessons Edward would have wanted them to learn. Samuel called it building an audience. I called it making sure the truth had witnesses. The next Sunday, Thomas came by as usual with Ashley. They brought flowers, yellow roses, my favorites, and a basket of expensive cheeses from that specialty shop on Newberry Street. Ashley hugged me, told me I looked tired, suggested maybe I should lie down more. Thomas checked my pill organizer, pretending to care about my health while planning to steal my independence. He mentioned Thanksgiving, said he'd invited a family friend to join us, someone who specialized in elder care and might have helpful suggestions. I smiled and thanked him. I accepted the flowers and arranged them in the crystal vase Edward gave me for our 20th anniversary. I served tea in the china that survived 3 generations of my family. And I played my role perfectly, the sweet, slightly confused old woman who needed her son's help and guidance. But while I poured tea, I thought about the documents locked in Samuel's office safe. I thought about Patricia's forensic trail that would hold up in any courtroom. I thought about the recordings I'd been making of every conversation since I discovered the theft, legal in Massachusetts, because I was party to the conversations. Thomas thought he was 3 days away from controlling my life. He didn't know he was 3 days away from learning the most expensive lesson a son could learn. Never underestimate the woman who taught you everything you know, especially when she's had 30 years of experience dealing with corporate thieves who were smarter and more ruthless than you'll ever be. As they left that afternoon, Ashley turned at the door with her practiced concerned expression and told me not to worry about anything, that Thomas would handle everything. I patted her hand with my elderly tremor, the one I'd been exaggerating for weeks, and told her I knew I could count on my family. The door closed behind them, and I watched through my front window as Thomas helped Ashley into their expensive car, the car he'd bought with my stolen money. They drove away from my Beacon Hill home, my castle that I'd defended for 45 years through recessions and renovations, and Edward's death. They thought they were going home to plan my institutional imprisonment. They didn't know they were driving toward the reckoning that would arrive in 3 days with a side of sweet potato casserole. The Monday before Thanksgiving, Thomas escalated, and that's when I knew we were running out of time. He showed up unannounced at 9 in the morning with Ashley and a woman he introduced as Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in cognitive assessments. They'd brought breakfast from my favorite bakery, apple turnovers that Edward and I used to share on Sunday mornings, and the whole scene was so carefully staged I could see the rehearsal behind it. Dr. Morrison was professional and kind, which somehow made it worse. She asked permission to chat with me about how I was feeling, how I was managing since Edward passed, whether I ever felt confused or overwhelmed. Her questions were gentle traps designed to build a case for incompetence. I played along beautifully. I pretended to struggle with the date, got the month right but mixed up the day. I mentioned misplacing my keys, forgetting appointments I'd actually kept perfectly. I let my sentences trail off occasionally, as if I'd lost my train of thought. Thomas watched with barely concealed satisfaction. Ashley took notes on her phone, probably documentation for the conservatorship filing. Dr. Morrison maintained her compassionate, professional demeanor, but I could see her forming conclusions. What none of them knew was that Samuel had already had me assessed by 2 independent psychiatrists the week before. Both had declared me cognitively intact, sharp, showing no signs of dementia or impairment. Their reports were notarized and sitting in Samuel's office, ready for court. But I let Dr. Morrison conduct her evaluation. I fumbled with simple arithmetic that I could do in my sleep, the same calculations I used to perform on multi-million-dollar budgets. I claimed I couldn't remember what I'd had for breakfast, even though I'd made myself the same oatmeal with blueberries I'd eaten for 40 years. The session lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, Dr. Morrison's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to concerned sympathy. She spoke to Thomas and Ashley in hushed tones in my kitchen while I sat in the living room, supposedly resting but actually hearing every word through the old air vent that connected the rooms, a quirk of the house's 1890s architecture that I'd discovered decades ago. Dr. Morrison told them she saw definite signs of cognitive decline. She recommended a full neurological workup and suggested that someone needed to oversee my daily activities. She used phrases like vulnerable adult and safety concerns and progressive deterioration. Thomas thanked her profusely. After she left, he came and sat beside me on the sofa, taking my hand with such false tenderness I wanted to vomit. He told me Dr. Morrison was worried about me. He said they were all worried. He explained that he'd been talking to a wonderful assisted living facility in Weston, just 20 minutes away, where I could have care around the clock and wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore. I asked about my house, the one Edward and I had bought in 1980 when Beacon Hill was barely affordable. Thomas squeezed my hand and said I shouldn't worry about the house, that he'd handle everything, that selling it would give me such a nice cushion for care expenses. The mask slipped for just a second. His eyes went to the crown molding, the original hardwood floors, the marble fireplace. He wasn't seeing his childhood home. He was seeing dollar signs. This house was worth nearly $3 million now, in a market that had gone insane over the past decade. He'd already calculated what his third of the inheritance would be, probably already spent it in his mind paying off casino debts. I nodded slowly and told him I trusted him to do what was best. Ashley, who'd been hovering nearby, actually got tears in her eyes at my supposed surrender. She hugged me and called me a brave woman for being so understanding about my condition. That afternoon, after they left, I called Catherine and Marcus on a video chat. Technology my supposedly declining brain handled perfectly fine. I told them what Thomas had done and what was coming at Thanksgiving dinner. Catherine cried. Marcus wanted to drive to Boston immediately and confront Thomas physically. I talked him down, reminded him that we needed to handle this legally and properly. I also called my grandchildren individually. Jennifer, Thomas's 28-year-old daughter, was a lawyer herself, working in family law in Providence. When I told her what her father was planning, the silence on the line lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then she asked very quietly if I was absolutely certain. I told her about the forensic audit, the documented transfers, the conservatorship petition. I told her about the 2 independent psychiatric evaluations Samuel had arranged that proved my cognitive fitness. I asked her if she could be at Thanksgiving dinner and if she could bring her lawyer instincts with her. Her voice was cold when she replied. She told me she'd be there and that she'd been wondering where her father got the money to pay off her law school loans 3 months ago. He'd told her it was a bonus from work. Now she knew it was stolen from his mother. Michael, her younger brother, was harder to reach. At 24, he still saw his father through sun-colored glasses. But when I told him the amounts involved and mentioned that the college fund I'd set up for him had been one of Thomas's targets, I heard something break in his voice. He promised to be at dinner. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, Samuel filed protective orders with the probate court. These weren't public yet, but they were in the system, ready to become active the moment Thomas tried to file his conservatorship petition. We'd also prepared an emergency restraining order blocking him from accessing any more of my accounts. Patricia finished her forensic report and had it officially certified. We now had a document trail that would stand up in both civil and criminal court. Samuel gently mentioned that pressing charges was an option, that elder financial abuse was a serious crime in Massachusetts, that Thomas could face up to 5 years in prison. I told him I'd decide after Thanksgiving. Part of me still hoped that confronting Thomas publicly, showing him the evidence, would shock him into acknowledging what he'd done, that some piece of the little boy I'd raised was still in there somewhere. Samuel looked at me with the sad wisdom of a man who'd practiced family law for 40 years. He didn't say what we both knew. People who steal from their elderly parents rarely feel remorse when caught. They feel anger at being denied what they'd already claimed in their minds. Wednesday morning, the day before Thanksgiving, Thomas came by with Ashley to help me prepare for the next day's dinner. They brought their contribution to the meal, an expensive wine I knew Thomas couldn't actually afford, and Ashley immediately started rearranging my kitchen. She took over in that way people do when they think you're incompetent, moving things from where I'd kept them for decades to places that made sense to her. Thomas went through my mail again, setting aside bills and statements, still maintaining the fiction of helpful son managing his confused mother's affairs. At one point, while Ashley was busy in the kitchen, Thomas came into the living room where I was supposedly dozing in Edward's old chair. I kept my eyes mostly closed but watched him through my lashes. Another trick from corporate negotiations when you wanted people to think they weren't being observed. He stood looking at me for a long time. I could see his face clearly, see the calculation there, the planning. He pulled out his phone and took a picture of me sleeping in the chair. Evidence for his case, I realized. The image of a helpless old woman needing care. Then he did something that broke the last piece of my heart that still belonged to him. He smiled. Not a sad smile, not even a guilty one. A satisfied smile. The smile of someone whose plan was coming together perfectly. He turned and saw Ashley watching him from the doorway. She smiled back. They shared a look of complete understanding, complete complicity. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just Thomas acting alone in desperation. This was both of them, working together, planning together, probably congratulating themselves on how clever they were, how easily they'd manipulated the old woman. After they left, I sat in Edward's chair for real this time, not pretending. I thought about all the Thanksgivings we'd hosted in this house, the years when the children were small, and we'd do the turkey wishbone, and Thomas always wanted to wish for snow. The later years when the grandchildren came, and we'd go around the table saying what we were grateful for. The last Thanksgiving with Edward, when he was already sick but insisted on carving the turkey himself. This Thanksgiving would be different. This Thanksgiving, the table would be set with truth instead of turkey, evidence instead of stuffing. I went to my study and pulled out the notebook I'd been keeping. Every incident documented, every conversation recorded, every lie cataloged. Patricia's forensic report, the psychiatric evaluations, the bank statements showing the missing $215,000. Samuel had prepared a folder for each family member: Catherine, Marcus, Jennifer, Michael, and Sophie. Even Thomas would get one, especially Thomas. His would be the thickest, containing not just the evidence of theft, but the criminal statutes he'd violated, the potential penalties, and the restitution requirements. That evening, I cooked my pies, pumpkin and apple, from scratch like always. My hands were steady as I rolled the crust. I made Edward's favorite sweet potato casserole with the pecan topping. I prepared the green bean almondine that Catherine loved and the cranberry sauce Marcus had requested every year since he was 5. I cooked like I'd done for 57 Thanksgivings, but this time every stir of the spoon felt like preparation for battle. This time I wasn't just feeding my family. I was setting the stage for the most important presentation of my life. More important than any corporate board meeting, any hostile negotiation, any financial audit. Because tomorrow, my son would learn what happened when you gambled on your mother's supposed incompetence. Tomorrow, he would discover that the house always wins, especially when the house is run by a woman who spent 30 years making men like him regret their underestimation. Tomorrow, at the table where I'd taught him his manners and his morals and his basic human decency, Thomas would find out that breakfast wasn't the only meal I could serve cold. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of November day that makes Boston look like a postcard. I was up at 5, the same time I used to wake for my executive meetings in the 80s. Some habits don't fade just because you retire. I set the dining room table with Edward's mother's china, the set that had survived the Depression and 2 world wars. Each plate had a folder beside it, cream-colored and professional, prepared by Samuel's office. They looked innocuous, like perhaps Thanksgiving trivia or family history. Only I knew they contained the systematic destruction of my son's plans. The turkey went in the oven at 6. By 7, I'd prepared most of the sides. By 8, I was dressed in the burgundy wool dress Edward always said brought out my eyes. I wore the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 50th anniversary just 2 months before he died. I looked in the mirror and saw an 82-year-old woman who'd fought her way through male-dominated boardrooms, survived 2 cancer diagnoses, buried the love of her life, and was now about to prove she wasn't finished fighting yet. Catherine and Marcus arrived first, at 9:30. They came together from the airport, having coordinated flights. Catherine hugged me so tight I felt my ribs creak. Marcus kept asking if I was really okay, if I needed anything, if he should talk to Thomas before dinner. I told them both to trust the process, to let it unfold. To remember that sometimes the best strategy is letting your opponent think they've already won right up until the moment you flip the board. Jennifer arrived at 10 with Michael. My granddaughter looked professional and angry in equal measure, her lawyer mask firmly in place. Michael looked hurt and confused, like he couldn't reconcile the father he knew with the father who'd stolen from his grandmother. Sophie came at 11 with her boyfriend, unaware of the undercurrents, but sensing something was off. I'd kept her partially in the dark. She was only 19 and didn't need the burden of knowing before the reveal. Thomas and Ashley arrived at noon exactly, fashionably punctual, carrying an expensive flower arrangement that probably cost $300 of my money. Thomas wore his best suit, the one he saved for important occasions. He kissed my cheek and asked how his favorite mother was feeling today. I smiled and told him I was grateful to have all my family together. I wasn't lying. I was grateful, just not in the way he thought. The meal preparation continued with everyone helping in that chaotic way large families have. Ashley took over the kitchen again, directing everything like she was already mistress of the house. Thomas played the attentive son, checking on me, asking if I needed to rest, suggesting I sit down while the young people handled the heavy lifting. Catherine watched all this with barely controlled fury. Marcus kept clenching and unclenching his fists. Jennifer maintained her lawyer composure, but her eyes tracked every move Thomas made. At one point, Thomas pulled Jennifer aside. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I stood at the stove, but I saw him gesture to me, saw him put on his concerned son expression. He was recruiting her, I realized, trying to get his lawyer daughter on board with the conservatorship plan, probably framing it as protecting Grandma from herself, as the loving thing to do. Jennifer's face remained neutral, but when she caught my eye across the room, I saw the cold calculation there. She'd inherited my mind for numbers and strategy. She knew exactly what her father was attempting. The morning passed in forced normalcy. Sophie told stories about her semester at BU. Michael talked about his new job in graphic design. Catherine and Marcus made strained small talk. Ashley complimented the house, mentioning what a shame it would be if I couldn't maintain it anymore. Thomas held court like he always did at family gatherings, telling jokes and stories, playing the successful son role. He'd gotten good at that over the years, and I wondered how much of his life had been performance. Had he ever been the person I thought he was, or had I just seen what I wanted to see? At noon, Samuel arrived with his wife Donna. I'd invited them to Thanksgiving countless times over the decades, but this year they'd accepted. Samuel carried his briefcase, which he set discreetly in my study. Donna brought her famous apple chutney and warm hugs for everyone. Thomas seemed mildly surprised to see Samuel, but not alarmed. The attorney had been a family friend for 40 years. His presence seemed natural enough. What Thomas didn't know was that Samuel had a court reporter waiting in a car 2 blocks away, ready to document everything if needed. That Samuel's briefcase contained not just the evidence folders, but also the legal paperwork to file criminal charges if I gave the word. At 12:30, I announced dinner was ready. Everyone gathered around the dining room table, the same table where we'd shared so many memories, the same table where Thomas had taken his first solid food as a baby, where we'd celebrated his graduation, his wedding, the births of his children. Now it would be the table where he learned the consequences of betrayal. We took our seats with the usual family chaos. Thomas insisted on sitting at the head of the table, Edward's old place. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. He'd already claimed the position of patriarch, already mentally moved into the role of family leader. Ashley sat beside him, hand on his arm, the picture of the supportive wife. Catherine and Marcus flanked me protectively. Jennifer positioned herself across from her father, with Michael beside her. Sophie and her boyfriend took the remaining spots, along with Samuel and Donna. The turkey sat golden and perfect at the center, surrounded by all the traditional dishes. The scene looked like a Norman Rockwell painting. The perfect American Thanksgiving. Thomas insisted on saying grace. He thanked God for family, for health, for the blessing of being together. He added a special prayer for me, asking for wisdom to care for aging parents and strength to make difficult decisions out of love. I kept my head bowed and my mouth shut. I'd need that strength he was praying for, but not in the way he imagined. After the amen, I stood. Everyone looked at me, probably expecting the traditional grandmother speech about gratitude and family bonds. Instead, I asked everyone to look at the folders beside their plates. Thomas glanced at his folder with mild curiosity. Ashley picked hers up with a pleasant smile. The others opened theirs with various levels of confusion. I let them read for exactly 30 seconds, watching comprehension dawn on their faces in waves. Catherine gasped. Marcus swore. Jennifer's lawyer mask cracked into something raw and furious. Michael went white. Sophie looked confused, not fully understanding the financial documents. Samuel and Donna already knew, of course, but they watched Thomas with the calm assessment of people witnessing justice. Thomas was still scanning the first page, the summary sheet that laid out the theft in clear terms. $215,000. Specific dates and amounts, bank account numbers, destination accounts, casino records. He looked up at me, and for just a second, I saw panic cross his face before he locked it down. He started to speak, but I held up one hand. The gesture was so reminiscent of my old boardroom authority that he actually stopped. Then I told them all exactly what had been happening in my house for the past 6 months. I told them about the missing glasses, the hidden bills, the systematic campaign to make me seem incompetent. I told them about the 50,000 I'd discovered, then the full 215,000 Patricia's audit had revealed. I told them about the gambling debts, the casino payments, the desperate financial situation Thomas had been hiding from everyone. I told them about Dr. Morrison's evaluation, the one designed to build a case for conservatorship, and how I'd had independent psychiatrists evaluate me the same week. I told them about the conservatorship petition sitting in Thomas's attorney's office, ready to file. About how he'd planned to have me declared incompetent at this very dinner, probably right after dessert, with a notary standing by to make it all legal and official. I told them how he'd intended to sell this house, liquidate my investments, put me in a facility, and control everything Edward and I had built over 50 years of marriage. My voice stayed steady through all of it. 3 decades of corporate presentations had taught me how to deliver devastating information with professional calm. When I finished, the silence around the table was absolute. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it, opened it again, finally found words. He told me I was confused, that I was misunderstanding everything, that he'd only been trying to help me. His voice had that reasonable tone people use when they're trying to gaslight you, trying to make you doubt your own reality. I didn't argue. I simply asked Samuel to explain the legal weight of the documents in front of them. Samuel stood and walked through the evidence methodically. The forensic audit that would hold up in any court, the electronic trail that proved Thomas had initiated the transfers, the casino records that showed where the money went, the 2 independent psychiatric evaluations showing my complete cognitive competence, the legal statutes Thomas had violated. He explained that elder financial abuse was a criminal offense in Massachusetts, carrying up to 5 years imprisonment and full restitution. He noted that I could file criminal charges today if I chose. Thomas had gone from pale to red to pale again. Ashley was crying, mascara running down her carefully made-up face. She kept whispering that they were just trying to help, that they were worried, that this was all a misunderstanding. Catherine asked how they could live with themselves. Marcus asked how Thomas could steal from his own mother. Jennifer sat frozen, staring at her father like she'd never seen him before. Thomas finally found his spine and his anger. He stood up, pointed at me, and accused me of setting him up, of spying on him, of being cruel and vindictive. He said I'd always favored the other children, always been harder on him, always expected him to fail. His voice rose with each accusation. He said the money was practically his anyway, part of his eventual inheritance, so what did it matter if he used it now when he actually needed it? He said I was being selfish, hoarding wealth I couldn't possibly spend at my age. He said I was a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see him succeed. That's when he did it. When he came around the table, his face twisted with rage and entitlement, and slapped me across the face. The sound echoed in the silent dining room. The same slap that had started this countdown 3 days ago, now repeated in front of witnesses. My cheek burned. My eyes watered from the physical impact. But I didn't move. I stood there and looked at my son, and I saw clearly what he'd become, or maybe what he'd always been under the surface. Marcus lunged for Thomas, but Samuel caught him. Catherine was crying. Jennifer had her phone out, recording everything. Ashley was screaming. And I stood there, tasting blood from my split lip, and knew that the last thread of motherly mercy I'd been holding on to had just been severed. The rest of the Thanksgiving dissolved into chaos, but the important work was done. The truth was out. The family had witnessed everything, and Thomas had just committed assault in front of 8 witnesses, including an officer of the court. Sometimes the greatest gift a mother can give her son is teaching him that actions have consequences. Thomas was about to receive the most expensive education of his life. The Friday after Thanksgiving, Thomas called me 17 times. I didn't answer. On the 18th call, he left a voicemail that cycled through anger, manipulation, and finally something that might have been genuine panic. He needed to talk to me. He needed to explain. Things had gotten out of hand. He'd been under pressure. I didn't understand the stress he was under. Couldn't we work this out as a family, like reasonable people? I deleted the message and called Samuel. By Monday, we had the restraining order in place. Thomas was barred from contacting me directly, from coming within 200 yards of my house, from accessing any accounts or property in my name. The order was temporary, pending a full hearing, but it would do for now. The legal machinery had started grinding, and once that process begins, it's nearly impossible to stop. I'd learned that in my corporate days when we sued vendors for contract breaches. The law moves slowly until suddenly it doesn't, and then it's an avalanche. Patricia's forensic report was filed with both the district attorney's office and the probate court. The evidence was overwhelming. Electronic transfers, casino records, the conservatorship petition that proved intent. The DA's office called me personally to discuss pressing criminal charges. I told them I needed time to think. What I actually needed was to see if Thomas would come to his senses, if somewhere under the gambling addiction and the entitlement, there was still a shred of the son I'd raised. That Tuesday, Jennifer came to the house. She'd taken the train down from Providence, showed up at my door looking like she hadn't slept since Thanksgiving. Her eyes were red, her professional polish replaced with raw grief. She asked if she could come in, if we could talk. I made tea, Earl Grey, her favorite since she was 12, and we sat in my living room while she cried and apologized and tried to make sense of her father's actions. She told me things I hadn't known, about how Thomas had been gambling for years since before his kids were in college, about how Ashley knew and enabled it, sometimes going to the casinos with him, about how they'd always seemed to have money troubles despite Thomas's decent salary as an operations manager. Jennifer told me about times she'd loaned her father money, amounts she'd written off as family helping family, about how he'd borrowed from Michael too, from Ashley's parents, from friends, how the pattern had been there for years but nobody had connected the dots. She told me the worst part, that 2 years ago, right after Edward got his terminal diagnosis, Thomas had joked to Ashley about how at least Mom's money would come through soon. Jennifer had overheard it and been horrified, but Thomas had claimed he was just stressed and didn't mean it. Now she understood. He'd been planning this for at least 2 years, waiting for Edward to die so he could execute his scheme without his father's interference. My granddaughter looked at me with eyes that had lost their innocence about family. She asked what I was going to do, whether I was going to press criminal charges, whether there was any way to fix this. I told her the truth, that I didn't know yet. That part of me wanted to see Thomas in prison for what he'd done. That another part, the mother part that never quite dies no matter how badly your children hurt you, wanted to give him one chance to make things right. Jennifer pulled out a folder from her bag. She'd been doing her own investigation, using her legal training and access to court records. She'd found something that changed the equation. Thomas's gambling debts were worse than we'd thought. He owed money to people who weren't official casinos, private games, underground operations, the kind of people who didn't take you to court when you didn't pay. They took other measures. She showed me texts she'd found on Michael's phone, messages from their father asking for money, describing threats he'd received, talking about men who'd shown up at his house. The timeline matched up with when the thefts from my accounts had accelerated. Thomas wasn't just greedy. He was desperate and terrified. He'd gotten in over his head with dangerous people and saw stealing from his elderly mother as his only way out. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained it in a way that made my heart hurt all over again. That afternoon, I called Detective Sarah Brennan, the officer handling the financial abuse case. She came to my house, a courtesy she extended because of my age and the high-profile nature of the case, and we talked about options. She told me that cases like mine were becoming more common. Adult children seeing their parents' savings as their own future money, getting impatient, sometimes taking matters into their own hands. The law had gotten stricter about elder financial abuse in recent years, specifically because of this trend. She also told me about the gambling connection. Her department had been watching some of the underground operations Thomas had gotten involved with. If he testified about those operations, provided evidence, it could help bring down some dangerous people. In exchange, the DA might be willing to negotiate on Thomas's charges. Not drop them, he'd still face consequences, but potentially reduce them if he cooperated fully and made full restitution. I asked what full restitution meant. She explained that Thomas would have to pay back every penny he'd stolen, plus interest and penalties. Given his financial situation, that would probably mean selling his house, liquidating any assets he had, and setting up a long-term payment plan for the remainder. He'd be financially ruined. But he wouldn't necessarily go to prison if he cooperated and if I was willing to advocate for a suspended sentence. I told Detective Brennan I needed time to think. She gave me her card and told me to call when I was ready to decide. That evening, I sat in Edward's study and thought about justice versus mercy. In my corporate days, I'd been known for being tough but fair. When someone made a mistake, I gave them a chance to correct it. But when someone deliberately betrayed trust, I showed no mercy. Thomas had deliberately betrayed me in the worst way possible. He'd stolen from me, tried to have me declared incompetent, and when confronted, he'd struck me. But he was also my son. The baby I'd nursed through colic, the toddler who'd climbed into my bed during thunderstorms, the young man who'd been so proud when he got his first real job. Somewhere in his 55 years, something had gone wrong, and I hadn't seen it or couldn't stop it. The phone rang at 8 o'clock. Catherine, calling from Seattle to check on me. We talked for over an hour about Thomas, about the family, about what came next. She told me she'd support whatever decision I made, but that she couldn't forgive Thomas for what he'd done to me. Marcus called after Catherine, saying basically the same thing. Both of them offered to cover any legal costs, to help me however I needed. Both of them said they'd understand if I wanted to put Thomas in prison. At 10 o'clock, still awake and thinking, I got an unexpected call. Ashley. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She told me she was leaving Thomas, that she'd moved out on Sunday and filed for divorce on Monday, that she was sorry for her part in everything, that she should have stopped him years ago, that the gambling had destroyed their marriage and their family. She told me about debts I didn't know about, credit cards maxed out, a second mortgage on the house that was already underwater, loans from loan sharks who charged interest rates that should be illegal. She told me Thomas owed almost $800,000 to various people and entities. The $215,000 he'd stolen from me hadn't even covered half his debts. He'd been planning to take more, much more. The conservatorship wasn't just about access to my checking account. It was about getting control of my entire estate, the house, the investments, everything, to liquidate it all and pay off his debts. If he'd succeeded, I would have ended up in a state nursing facility with nothing. Everything Edward and I built would have gone to paying off Thomas's gambling debts. Ashley sobbed through the phone that she was sorry, so sorry that she'd let fear and codependency keep her quiet, that she was willing to testify against Thomas if it would help my case. I thanked her for calling and for the information. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my house and made my decision. The next morning, I called Samuel and Detective Brennan and set up a meeting. Then, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I called Thomas, not to reconcile, but to negotiate. We met at Samuel's office the following Monday, with Samuel present as my attorney and a court reporter documenting everything. Thomas looked terrible, gaunt, unshaven, wearing clothes that needed ironing. His eyes darted around like a trapped animal's. I told him I knew about the underground gambling debts. I told him I knew he was in danger from loan sharks who didn't care about family connections or legal niceties. I told him I knew the theft from me had been an act of desperation. Then I gave him my terms: full cooperation with police on the underground gambling operations, complete testimony about everyone involved, everything he knew. That was non-negotiable. Those operations needed to be shut down before they destroyed other families. Full restitution of every penny stolen, plus 20% interest and legal fees. This would be secured by a lien on any future inheritance, any property, any assets he might acquire in the next 20 years. He'd be paying me back for the rest of his life. Mandatory treatment for gambling addiction at a facility I would choose and monitor. 1 year minimum residential treatment, with continued therapy and Gamblers Anonymous attendance for at least 5 years after. No contact with me except through attorneys, unless and until I decided I was ready, which might be years or might be never. He'd given up the right to my presence in his life. Public acknowledgement of his actions. He would write letters to every family member explaining what he'd done and apologizing. He would make a statement to the court taking full responsibility. In exchange for all this, I would advocate for a suspended sentence. He wouldn't go to prison if he cooperated fully and stuck to every term. But if he violated any part of our agreement, I would personally ensure he served the maximum sentence for elder financial abuse. Thomas listened to all this with his head down. When I finished, he looked up at me with tears running down his face. He asked if I could ever forgive him. I told him the truth, that I didn't know, that forgiveness wasn't something I could promise, that he'd shattered something fundamental in our relationship, and I wasn't sure it could be repaired. But I also told him he was still my son, and I wouldn't abandon him completely, despite how thoroughly he'd abandoned his duty to me. That if he genuinely worked to change, to address his addiction, to take responsibility for his actions, then maybe someday we could rebuild something. Not what we had before, that was gone forever, but something new, based on honesty instead of enabling. He signed the agreement that day. Samuel witnessed it. The court reporter documented his verbal acceptance of all terms. 2 weeks later, Thomas provided testimony that led to the arrest of 3 people running illegal gambling operations in Boston and Atlantic City. His cooperation resulted in raids that shut down significant underground gambling rings. The house in Brookline went on the market in January. Thomas moved into a studio apartment in Malden, close to the treatment facility where he'd begin his year-long residential program. Ashley's divorce was proceeding, splitting what little assets remained. Jennifer told me her father had hit rock bottom, but maybe that's what he needed. Michael was still processing everything, working through his feelings in therapy. And I returned to my quiet life in my Beacon Hill home, surrounded by 45 years of memories and the security I'd fought to protect. The decisive resource in this battle hadn't been money or lawyers or evidence, though all of those mattered. It had been the clarity to see the difference between enabling and helping, between emotional manipulation and genuine remorse, between family loyalty and self-destruction. Edward always said I had a gift for knowing when to be hard and when to be soft. He'd been talking about my business career, but it applied to this too. I'd been hard enough to protect myself and hold Thomas accountable, but soft enough to offer him a path back to humanity, even if I never fully trusted him again. That balance between justice and mercy, between protection and abandonment, was the hardest navigation of my 82 years. Harder than any corporate negotiation, any financial crisis, any loss I'd endured, but I'd survived it. And I'd done it on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my assets protected. Spring came to Boston like a promise of renewal. The magnolias bloomed on Commonwealth Avenue, and I took my morning walks past gardens coming back to life after the brutal winter. Every step reminded me that survival isn't just about enduring the cold. It's about being strong enough to see the next season. Thomas was 3 months into his residential treatment program by March. His therapist called me monthly with updates, which I'd agreed to as part of the treatment plan. The calls were clinical, professional, progress on accepting responsibility, work on understanding his addiction triggers, family therapy sessions he was doing alone since Ashley had finalized the divorce. I didn't visit. I wasn't ready, and I'd been clear about that. But I sent a card once a month through Samuel's office, just to let Thomas know I was aware of his progress. The cards were simple, no sentiment beyond thinking of you. But they were contact, and that meant something. Jennifer visited me regularly, bringing Michael when he was ready. My grandchildren were finding their way through the wreckage their father had created. Jennifer had gone to Al-Anon meetings for families of addicts, learning how to navigate her relationship with a father who'd betrayed her trust. Michael had started seeing a therapist to work through his anger and disappointment. We had Sunday dinners sometimes, the three of us, at my house. It wasn't the same as the big family gatherings we used to have, but it was real in a way those gatherings had never been. No performance, no hiding, no pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Catherine came to visit in April, staying for a full week. We went through old photo albums, talked about Edward, cried together over what we'd lost. Not just Edward, but the family structure we'd thought was solid. She helped me sort through things I'd been avoiding, including Edward's clothes that I'd kept hanging in the closet for 3 years. It was time, she said gently, to let some things go. Marcus called every Sunday, a ritual he'd started after Thanksgiving. We'd talk about his work, his kids, his life in Atlanta, but we'd also talk about Thomas, about addiction, about how families break and sometimes mend. Marcus had been the angriest about what Thomas did, but he was slowly moving towards something like understanding, if not forgiveness. The house sale in Brookline closed in early May. After paying off Thomas's debts, the legitimate ones, not the gambling debts which I'd made clear were his alone to handle, there was barely $30,000 left. That money went directly into the restitution account Samuel had set up. Thomas was making monthly payments from his disability coverage, small amounts but consistent. It would take decades to repay what he'd stolen, but he was starting. In late May, Patricia called with news. The underground gambling operation Thomas had testified against had resulted in convictions. 3 people were going to prison, and several others had taken plea deals. The DA was pleased with Thomas's cooperation and had formally recommended a suspended sentence as part of his plea agreement. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for June 15th. Samuel asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. It was my right, he explained, to tell the court how Thomas's actions had affected me. I spent a week thinking about what I wanted to say. What could I tell a judge that would capture the betrayal? How could I explain the loss of trust, the fear that I'd felt, the violation of having your own child try to steal your autonomy? But I also thought about what I wanted the outcome to be. Not revenge. I'd had enough of anger, not complete mercy either. Thomas needed consequences or the lesson wouldn't stick. Something in between, something that acknowledged the harm while allowing for the possibility of redemption. The hearing arrived on a Wednesday that felt like summer had come early. The courthouse was in downtown Boston, a building I'd walked past 10,000 times but never entered. Samuel met me at the entrance, offered his arm, which I took more for the symbolism than because I needed the support. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Thomas sat at the defendant's table with his public defender. He couldn't afford a private attorney anymore. He'd lost weight, his suit hanging loose. He looked older than 55, worn down by consequences. Our eyes met for a moment, his filled with tears immediately. I kept mine steady, refusing to give him the easy emotional absolution he was probably hoping for. The prosecutor went first, laying out the facts of the case. Elder financial abuse, $215,000 stolen over 4 months. Systematic campaign to have the victim declared incompetent. Assault during family confrontation. The litany of Thomas's crimes filled the courtroom with their ugly details. Then Thomas's attorney spoke, talking about addiction, about desperation, about rehabilitation. She presented evidence of his treatment progress, his cooperation with police, his genuine remorse. She asked for the suspended sentence, citing his clean record before this, his deteriorating mental health, his commitment to making things right. The judge listened to all of it with the impassive expression judges develop. Then she asked if I wanted to make a statement. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the witness stand like I was approaching a boardroom podium. Some skills you never lose. I told the judge about my life, about working my way up in a male-dominated field in the 1970s, about building a career through competence and determination, about the marriage I'd treasured, the family I'd raised, the security Edward and I had created through decades of hard work. I told her about the fear of losing my mind, the gaslight campaign, the violation of trust, about lying awake, wondering if I was actually becoming incompetent, if my own perceptions were failing, about the relief and rage of discovering the truth. I told her about the slap, about my own son's hand hitting my face in the house where I'd raised him with love. But I also told her about addiction, about how it turns people into versions of themselves they shouldn't be, about how Thomas had been a good father before the gambling consumed him, about how my grandchildren deserved a chance to have their father back, changed and better if he could manage it. I told the judge I supported the suspended sentence on the condition that Thomas completed his full treatment program, maintained his restitution payments, and had no contact with me unless I initiated it, that he needed to earn back the right to be called my son, and that might take years or might never happen. But I also said that destroying him completely wouldn't heal what he'd broken, that prison would just create more damage without addressing the addiction that caused this situation. That as much as I'd been hurt, I was a mother, and some part of me still hoped my son could be redeemed. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge thanked me and said she'd take a brief recess before sentencing. Samuel helped me back to my seat. Jennifer was in the gallery, Michael beside her, both of them crying quietly. Thomas had his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. 15 minutes later, the judge returned. She sentenced Thomas to 5 years in prison, suspended on the condition that he complete his treatment program, maintain his restitution payments, and commit no further crimes. He'd be on probation for 10 years. Any violation would mean immediate imprisonment. She also ordered him to have no contact with me except through attorneys unless I gave explicit permission. She called his actions a profound betrayal of the most vulnerable relationship, parent and child, and said she was giving him this chance solely because of my willingness to advocate for him and his cooperation with shutting down the gambling operations. She told Thomas directly that he'd been given a gift by his mother, the gift of another chance, and if he squandered it, she would personally ensure he served every day of his 5-year sentence. Thomas stood and told the judge he understood. His voice was hoarse, broken. He turned to look at me and mouthed, "Thank you." I didn't respond, just held his gaze for a moment before looking away. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. The case had gotten some media attention. Wealthy Beacon Hill widow, financial elder abuse, underground gambling connections. Samuel handled them while Jennifer got me to the car. As we drove away, I looked back at the courthouse steps. Thomas was standing there with his attorney, looking lost. Part of me wanted to go back, to hug him, to tell him it would be okay. The mother part that never quite dies. But the survivor part of me, the part that had protected myself when no one else would, knew I needed distance. That Thomas had to walk his own path back to humanity, and I couldn't do it for him. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and thought about timing, about how we spend our lives waiting for the right moment, to speak up, to act, to stand our ground. About how I'd waited just long enough to gather evidence, to build my case, to protect myself legally before making my move. If I'd confronted Thomas earlier, without preparation, he might have successfully pushed through the conservatorship. If I'd waited longer, more money would have disappeared. Or worse, he might have faced violence from the loan sharks he owed. The timing had been perfect, even though it hadn't felt that way while I was living through it. I thought about all the moments in my life when timing had mattered. Meeting Edward at exactly the right point in both our lives. Taking the CFO position when I did, just as the logistics industry was transforming. Retiring when I did. Giving me time with Edward before he got sick. And this, standing up to Thomas at exactly the moment when evidence, family support, and legal resources aligned to protect me while giving him a path to recovery. Edward used to say I had impeccable timing in business. I'd argue with him, say it was just preparation and luck. But maybe he was right. Maybe all those years of reading situations, of knowing when to move and when to wait, had prepared me for this ultimate challenge. The perfect moment isn't always the dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's the quiet preparation that comes before, the chess pieces moved into position while your opponent thinks they're winning. Thomas had thought he was in control, had thought he'd timed his move perfectly. After Edward died, before I could realize what was happening, while I was supposedly most vulnerable. He'd forgotten that vulnerability and powerlessness aren't the same thing, that a wounded animal is often the most dangerous, that underestimating your opponent is the surest path to defeat. The sun set over Beacon Hill, painting my living room in shades of gold. I sat in Edward's chair and felt, for the first time since that Tuesday morning when Thomas hit me, something like peace. Not forgiveness, that was still far away if it came at all. Not reconciliation, that required more from Thomas than he'd yet proven he could give. But peace in knowing I'd handled this situation exactly as it needed to be handled. With precision, with strategic timing, with the cold clarity that comes from decades of navigating complex situations where the stakes mattered. I'd protected myself. I'd held Thomas accountable. I'd given him a chance at redemption without sacrificing my own safety or dignity. And I'd done it all at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. Edward would have been proud. I was proud of myself. The completion of Thomas's residential treatment program came in early December, almost exactly a year after that awful Thanksgiving. His therapist called me on a Monday morning asking if I'd be willing to participate in his graduation ceremony. It was part of the program. Patients who'd completed treatment would give a presentation about their journey, and family members were invited to attend. I told her I'd think about it. Then I spent 3 days wrestling with the decision. Jennifer called me that week, telling me she'd decided to go. She said she wasn't ready to have a normal father-daughter relationship with Thomas, but she wanted to acknowledge his year of hard work. Michael was undecided, still working through his feelings in therapy. Catherine and Marcus both called, offering to fly in if I wanted support. Both of them left the decision entirely up to me, with no pressure either way. On Thursday evening, I called the treatment center and told them I'd attend. Not for Thomas, I was careful to clarify. For myself. To see if the man who'd stolen from me and struck me had actually done the work to understand why. The graduation was held on a Saturday afternoon in mid-December. The facility was in Framingham, a clean, modern building that looked more like a corporate retreat center than a rehab facility. I drove myself, refusing Jennifer's offer to pick me up. I needed the autonomy, the ability to leave on my own terms if I couldn't handle it. The ceremony was in a large community room. About 30 people had completed the program, with family members filling the seats. I spotted Jennifer immediately, professional as always, in a navy suit. Michael had decided to come after all, sitting beside his sister looking nervous. I took a seat in the back row. Old habits from corporate meetings, always sit where you can observe the whole room and leave quickly if needed. Thomas was third to present. When he walked to the front, I barely recognized him. He'd gained back some weight, but in a healthy way. His hair was neatly trimmed. He wore simple khakis and a button-down shirt, clothes he must have bought from Goodwill on his disability income. But it was his eyes that were different. The desperation was gone. So was the entitled anger I'd seen at Thanksgiving. What remained was something that looked like humility, mixed with exhaustion. He started by stating his name and his addiction. Then he told his story. He didn't sugarcoat it. He talked about his first bet at 23, a college basketball game that had given him a rush nothing else matched. About how it escalated over 30 years, slowly at first, then consuming everything. About the lies he'd told Ashley, the money he'd borrowed from friends and family, the second mortgage he'd hidden. He talked about sitting in his car outside a casino at 2 a.m, having just lost $12,000, and thinking about his sleeping children, about knowing he had a problem but convincing himself he could control it, that the next big win would fix everything. Then he talked about Edward's death, about how he'd watched his father die and thought not about the loss, but about the inheritance, about how he'd become someone who could watch his mother grieve and see only a financial opportunity. He described the 6 months of gaslighting, moving my things, hiding my bills, trying to make me believe I was losing my mind. He explained the reasoning. If I seemed incompetent, the conservatorship would be easy. If the conservatorship went through, he'd have access to everything: the house, the investments, the security his parents had built over 50 years. His voice cracked when he talked about the Thanksgiving confrontation, about looking at his mother's face across the dining room table and seeing not the woman who'd raised him, but an obstacle to his desperate need for money. About the rage he'd felt when his plan unraveled, rage at being caught, rage at the situation he'd put himself in, about hitting his 82-year-old mother in the face. The room was silent except for Thomas's voice and the occasional sound of someone crying. He talked about the months after, the court case, the moment when he realized he could go to prison for 5 years. He talked about his first night in this facility, lying in a single bed in a shared room, having lost everything: his house, his marriage, his children's respect, his mother's trust. About hitting bottom so hard he thought he might not survive it. Then he talked about the work, the therapy, the group sessions, the 12 steps, the brutal honesty required to really look at what he'd become. About accepting that he was an addict, that he'd hurt people, that he'd betrayed the most fundamental relationship of his life. He talked about writing letters to everyone he'd hurt, about the ones who wrote back and the ones who didn't, about learning that not all damage can be repaired, that some relationships don't survive betrayal, and that was a consequence he had to live with. He talked about me, about the mother who'd worked in a male-dominated field to provide for her family, who'd taught him about integrity and honesty, who'd sacrificed so he could have opportunities she never had, about how he'd repaid all that by trying to steal her dignity along with her money. He said that the hardest part wasn't accepting his own addiction. It was accepting that he'd become the kind of person who could abuse his own mother, that he'd looked at my white hair and seen weakness instead of wisdom, that he'd mistaken age for incompetence. Then he said something that made me sit up straighter in my chair. He said that in a twisted way I'd saved his life, that if I'd pressed full criminal charges, if I'd let him go to prison, he'd probably be dead now. That the gambling debts he'd accumulated had put him in danger from people who didn't care about prison or consequences. That his cooperation with police, done as part of his plea deal with me, had gotten him into witness protection protocols that had saved him from the loan sharks. That by offering him a path to treatment instead of prison, I'd given him the only chance he had at survival and redemption. That he might never be able to repay the money he'd stolen, might never earn back my trust or my love. But he wanted me to know he was trying, that every day he stayed sober, every payment he made on restitution, every session with his therapist was an attempt to become someone worthy of being called my son again. He said he understood if that day never came, that he'd destroyed something precious and might never be able to rebuild it. But he was going to try anyway, for the rest of his life, whether I ever acknowledged the effort or not. When he finished, he looked directly at me for the first time. Our eyes met across the room. I saw remorse there, and shame, and something that might have been hope. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just held his gaze, letting him see that I was present, that I'd heard him, that I was still here. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was witness. Sometimes that's all we can offer. After the ceremony, there was a reception with coffee and cookies. Jennifer and Michael went to talk to Thomas. I watched them from across the room, awkward hugs, tears, halting conversation. They were finding their way back to each other, or finding a new way forward. I wasn't sure which. I stayed at the reception for exactly 30 minutes. Professional courtesy, the same amount of time I'd spent at a corporate event where attendance was expected but enthusiasm wasn't. Then I headed for the exit. Thomas caught me at the door. Not physically, he kept the mandated distance, but with his voice. He said my name. Just Mom. Nothing else. I turned and looked at him. Really looked, for the first time since before Thanksgiving. I saw a man who'd aged a decade in a year, who'd lost everything and was starting from zero, who might actually be doing the work to become someone different. I told him I heard his presentation, that it was honest, that I appreciated his acknowledgement of what he'd done. I told him I wasn't ready for more than that. That trust, once broken, the way he'd broken it, didn't repair quickly or easily. That he had years of proving himself ahead of him before I'd consider letting him back into my life in any meaningful way. But I also told him that I was glad he'd survived, that I was glad he was getting help, that somewhere under the anger and the hurt, I still remembered the little boy who'd climbed into my lap for stories, and I hoped he could find his way back to the decent person he'd been before addiction took over. Then I left, walked out to my car, drove home to Beacon Hill, and sat in my living room trying to process what I'd felt. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't closure. It was something more complex, acknowledgement that the situation was what it was, that we were both surviving it, that the future was uncertain. That evening, Catherine called. I told her about the ceremony, about Thomas's presentation, about our brief exchange at the door. She asked how I felt. I told her I felt tired, that standing my ground had been necessary but exhausting, that protecting myself had been the right choice but had come at a cost. That being strong doesn't mean you don't feel the weight of it. She said something then that Edward used to say, that the hardest decisions are rarely between good and evil. They're between two difficult paths, and you just have to choose which difficult you can live with. I'd chosen to protect myself while leaving the door open for Thomas to earn his way back to humanity. It was the difficult path that let me look at myself in the mirror, the one that honored both my need for safety and my hope that people can actually transform. Whether Thomas would do the work required remained to be seen, but I'd done my part. I'd shown him the path. The walking was up to him. As I sat in Edward's chair that night, looking at the photos on the mantel, our wedding day, the kids as babies, family gatherings from happier times, I thought about Revelation, about how the truth had come out that Thanksgiving, explosive and painful, about how today had been another kind of revelation, quieter but just as significant. Thomas revealing the depth of his understanding about what he'd done. Me revealing that I was still here, still standing, still capable of complexity even after everything. The revelation wasn't that the story had a happy ending. It was that endings aren't really endings at all. They're just transitions to whatever comes next. And what came next for me was a life I'd fought to protect, a dignity I'd refused to surrender, and the complicated piece of knowing I'd handled an impossible situation as well as anyone could. The rest was up to Thomas. My part of the revelation was complete. It's been 18 months since Thomas hit me in my kitchen. I still live in the Beacon Hill house where Edward and I built our life together. I still wake up at 6 every morning, still have my coffee in the same china cup I've used for 40 years. Some things don't need to change, but other things have. Thomas completed his residential program and moved into a sober living facility in Quincy. He works at a warehouse now, loading trucks for $12 an hour, a far cry from his old operations manager position. Every month, his restitution payment arrives in the account Samuel manages. It's only $200 monthly, barely making a dent in what he owes, but it's consistent. He hasn't missed a payment in 18 months. He attends Gamblers Anonymous meetings 5 times a week. His sponsor calls Samuel quarterly to confirm compliance with his probation terms. Thomas hasn't placed a bet, hasn't entered a casino, hasn't even bought a lottery ticket. The addiction that consumed 30 years of his life is in remission, which isn't the same as cured, but it's something. Jennifer sees him once a month for coffee, supervised, neutral locations, conversations that start awkward and are slowly becoming less so. She tells me about these meetings sometimes when she visits for Sunday dinner. She says her father is different, quieter, humbler, broken in ways that might actually be healthy. Michael started seeing Thomas about 6 months ago, less frequently than Jennifer, more cautiously, but the relationship is rebuilding. Michael told me recently that his father apologized for stealing from the college fund I'd set up, that he's trying to pay back that portion first, even though it's technically all the same debt. As for me and Thomas, we've had 3 supervised conversations in 18 months, all at Samuel's office, all with my attorney present, all strictly about practical matters. He updates me on his progress. I listen without comment. At the end of each meeting, I tell him I'm glad he's staying sober. It's not warmth, it's not forgiveness. But it's acknowledgement, and that's more than I thought I'd be able to give a year ago. Ashley, surprisingly, calls me sometimes. She's rebuilding her own life, going back to school to become a substance abuse counselor. She's in therapy dealing with codependency, learning about the ways she enabled Thomas's addiction. Our conversations are brief, but genuine. The divorce freed her to become someone she should have been years ago. Catherine visits from Seattle every few months. Marcus comes from Atlanta twice a year. We've started a new tradition. The 3 of us siblings, along with Jennifer, Michael, and Sophie, gather for holidays. Not at my house, which still holds too many loaded memories, but at restaurants or rented spaces. We're creating new traditions untainted by what happened. Sophie graduated from BU in May. Her ceremony was the first time the whole family was in one place since that catastrophic Thanksgiving. Thomas wasn't there. He understood that certain spaces aren't his to occupy anymore, but everyone else was. We celebrated my youngest granddaughter's achievement, and for a few hours, we felt like a family again. Different, damaged, but still connected. The house in Beacon Hill has become more than just where I live. I host a weekly coffee morning for other women my age, many of them widows like me. We talk about everything: investments, health, family complications, the challenges of aging in a society that sees elderly people as obsolete. Several of these women have confided their own stories of financial abuse by adult children. It's more common than anyone wants to admit: the slow theft, the gaslighting, the attempts to get power of attorney. I've helped 3 of them connect with Samuel, helped them protect themselves before situations escalated the way mine did. There's power in surviving something and then using that survival to help others navigate similar storms. I've also started speaking. Samuel connected me with the elder rights organization that advocates for financial abuse victims. I give talks at senior centers, community groups, legal aid offices. I tell my story, not for sympathy, but as a warning and a roadmap. I talk about the signs of financial abuse, about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, about the importance of maintaining control of your own finances regardless of age, about how cognitive competence doesn't decline just because your hair turns white. I talk about the specific steps I took, documenting everything, consulting attorneys, getting independent psychiatric evaluations. I provide a framework others can follow to protect themselves. And I talk about the complicated aftermath, about how protecting yourself from family is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, about how you can hold someone accountable and still hope for their redemption, about how strength and vulnerability aren't opposites. The response has been overwhelming. I get letters from people across the country who've heard me speak or seen media coverage of my case. Adult children thanking me for helping them understand their parents' situation. Elderly people telling me my story gave them courage to stand up to exploitation. One woman wrote that she'd been about to sign over power of attorney to her son when she heard me speak. She said my talk saved her from losing everything. She got her own attorney, discovered her son had already been forging checks, and stopped him before he could drain her accounts. That letter is framed on my desk, right next to the photograph of Edward and me on our wedding day. Both remind me why the fight mattered. The money Thomas stole, I've replaced through careful investing. Patricia, the forensic accountant who helped me, occasionally calls with investment advice. My portfolio has actually grown in the past 18 months. I'm more financially secure now than before the theft, which feels like the universe's way of saying I made the right choices. I travel more now. I spent 3 weeks in Italy last spring, walking through ruins that have survived empires and remembering that survival itself is a kind of victory. I'm planning a trip to Japan for next fall, something Edward and I always talked about but never did. I'm learning that life after betrayal isn't about returning to what was. It's about building something new from the pieces that remain. Last month, on what would have been Edward's 85th birthday, I drove to his grave and told him everything. About Thomas, about the theft, about how I'd handled it, about how much I'd needed his wisdom and support through it all, about how I'd tried to make decisions he would be proud of. I told him that I'd protected what we built together, that our life's work hadn't been stolen or squandered, that I'd honored his memory by refusing to be a victim. And I told him I thought I was going to be okay, that at 83 years old, after everything I'd survived, I was still standing, still strong, still myself. A few days ago, I got a letter from Thomas, not through attorneys. This was personal, asking permission first through Samuel to send it directly. I gave permission, curious what he had to say. The letter was 10 pages, handwritten. He wrote about his 1.5 years of sobriety, about the work he was doing in therapy to understand not just his addiction, but the entitlement and weakness that had let him justify stealing from his mother. He wrote about specific memories, me teaching him to ride a bike, helping with his homework, attending every school play and soccer game. He said he'd spent months in therapy trying to reconcile how the mother he remembered with love could become the target of his cruelty. That he understood now it wasn't me who'd transformed. It was him. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, that he understood our relationship might never recover, but he wanted me to know he was trying to become someone who deserved to exist in the same world as the woman who'd raised him. At the end of the letter, he asked if, maybe someday when I was ready, we could have coffee. Just the two of us. No attorneys, no mediators. Just a son trying to tell his mother he was sorry and a mother who could choose whether or not to listen. I haven't answered that letter yet. I'm still deciding what I want. But what I know is this. I'm here, in my home, in control of my life, making my own choices. I survived my son's betrayal. I protected myself without completely destroying him. I held firm boundaries while leaving room for the possibility of redemption. That's more than survival. That's victory on my terms. I sit in my living room now, in Edward's chair, watching the sun set over Beacon Hill. The same view I've had for 46 years. The magnolias will bloom again next spring. The seasons will continue their endless cycle. And I'll still be here, sharp and strong, and refusing to be diminished by anyone who mistakes my white hair for weakness. To everyone who's watching from wherever you are in the world, I want you to know something. Aging doesn't mean powerlessness. Experience is its own weapon. And the wisdom you've accumulated over decades is worth more than any asset someone might try to steal. If you're facing something similar, document everything. Trust your instincts. Get legal help before the situation escalates. Don't let anyone, family or otherwise, make you believe you're incompetent when you know you're not. And if you're an adult child watching this, tempted by your parents' resources, remember that elder abuse isn't just morally wrong. It's a crime with serious consequences. But more than that, it's a betrayal that leaves scars on both sides that may never fully heal. My breakfast that Wednesday morning after Thomas hit me wasn't exotic or dramatic. It was simple: evidence, accountability, and the refusal to be a victim. Sometimes the most powerful meals are the ones that leave a bitter taste that forces someone to face what they've done. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. And if this story resonated with you, if you know someone who needs to hear it, please share it and subscribe to this channel. Stories like mine need to be told, so the next generation of elders knows they don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from family. I'm Beatrice Caldwell. I'm 83 years old, and I'm still here, still fighting. still refusing to let anyone write the ending to my story but me. Thank you for listening.